Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks all for attending the presentation today. I'm Yvonne and I graduated from UC Irvine in spring of 2021. And my advisors and mentors are Dr. Maureen Craig, Dr. Ariel Allen, and Michelle Lee from New York University. And today I'm presenting our work on the perceptions of the American racial hierarchy. And the background for our research interest stems from the changing racial composition of America. Data show that in most parts of America, racial diversity is increasing over time, and we are interested in how racial groups in America perceive each other in this racially diverse environment. Stereotypes are also part of the conversation about racial diversity. In this study, we explored two dimensions of thinking about the American racial hierarchy, which are connected to stereotypes about economic disadvantage and cultural foreignness. We aim to replicate findings from the racial positioning model, a 4-quadrant stereotyping model developed by researchers Zhao and Sheridan. And these two axes represent two key dimensions in which racial groups are commonly stereotyped and discriminated against. For instance, in the economic dimension, which the racial positioning model refers to as inferiority superiority, Black Americans tend to be stereotyped as inferior. And in the cultural dimension, Asian Americans tended to be stereotyped as foreign. In this model, white Americans were ranked the highest in superiority, followed by Asian Americans, while Hispanic Americans, Arab Americans, Native Americans, and Black Americans ranked below the midpoint. And in our study specifically, the two axes of the racial positioning model, which we refer to as economic and cultural dimensions, we are interested in learning about which dimension is more prominent when thinking about the American racial hierarchy more generally. For instance, if neither an economic or cultural context was cued, what would participant rankings of the American racial hierarchy look like? So our research question, we'd like to know which dimension, economic or cultural, do people default to when ranking groups along the American racial hierarchy? And after brainstorming research questions that combine our research interests, we fielded an online survey. Dr. Craig, Michelle, Elle, and I worked together to design the questions and survey logic, and I programmed the survey in Qualtrics. And we all ran the analyses and created graphs in R. And this is a breakdown of our participant demographics. So in the first part of the study, participants are instructed to rank the following racial groups: Hispanic, Black, White, and Asian Americans along the American racial hierarchy using a ladder as a visual aid. And this is the prompt they saw. Think of this ladder as representing where people stand in terms of the social hierarchy in the United States. Placement at the top of the ladder represents people who are best off in the social hierarchy with a score of 10, and placement at the bottom of the ladder represents people who are the worst off in the social hierarchy with a corresponding score of 1. Next, to evaluate rankings in economic dimension, participants were asked to rank the same racial groups along an additional ladder. For the economic ladder, the top represents those with the most money, education, and the best jobs, while those at the bottom have the least money, education, and worst jobs or no job. And finally, for the cultural ladder, the top represents those who best fit into American culture and identity, while those at the bottom represent those who are ill-fitted into American culture and identity. And again, participants were asked to rank the same major racial groups on all three general, economic, and cultural ladders. And to preview the graphs, I'm going to be showing rain cloud plots that depict the distribution of rankings and group means. In the x-axis, we have the 4 racial groups, and on the y-axis, we have participant rankings of the 4 racial groups' perceived general rankings, where a score of 1 represents those who are worst off, and a score of 10 represents those who are best off. The first graphic on the left shows the distribution of rankings and group means of participants' perceived general rankings. And these data were constructed as a rain cloud plot. The rain cloud shape represents the distribution of data, and the dots or raindrops represent each participant's data point. And the black diamond represents the mean, and the range around the mean represents the 95% confidence interval. And here in the general rankings, white Americans were ranked the highest, followed by Asian Americans, then Black and Hispanic Americans, whose general rankings were not statistically significantly different from each other. Next, we compare the rankings of the general and economic dimensions side by side. The general rankings remain on the left, while the economic rankings are on the right, and visually the means and rank order of groups look very similar to each other. In both questions, white Americans were ranked the highest, followed by Asian Americans, Black and Hispanic Americans, whose economic rankings were not statistically significantly different. And next, we compare the general and cultural dimensions. The general rankings remain on the left, while the cultural rankings are on the right. And in cultural rankings, white Americans were ranked the highest, followed by Black Americans, and then Asian and Hispanic Americans, whose cultural rankings were not statistically significantly different. And our findings replicate the racial positioning model, in which Black Americans were stereotyped as less American than white Americans, but more American than Asian and Hispanic Americans. While results show that white Americans retain the highest ranking across all 3 ladders, the rank order of Black and Asian Americans switch when moving from economic to cultural dimension, showing that when the context changes, the perceived rankings will also change. And finally, contrast analysis results indicated that the economic dimension is more aligned with perceptions of the general American racial hierarchy rather than the cultural dimension. When considering racial groups' positioning in the United States, our results suggest that people tend to default to economic rankings rather than cultural rankings. And this could have implications for perceptions of social groups' rankings based on relative advantage and disadvantage, especially if people don't consider the varied ways that groups experience marginalization. For instance, Asian Americans are perceived as economically advantaged, but stereotyped as culturally foreign. And if we only focus on previous research and models that have centered economic frameworks, we probably wouldn't gain a comprehensive understanding of racial stereotyping in American society. Thus, future research should draw upon inclusive models that consider a variety of different dimensions, and incorporating these inclusive models will be critical in understanding the complex intergroup dynamics between racial groups in the United States, as the proportion of minority groups are continuing to increase. Finally, these results are only the first part of our study, and for the next round of our analyses, we plan to evaluate whether the proximity of group rankings are related to expectations for whether groups will coalesce to work together on a domain-relevant issue. For example, if Black and Hispanic Americans are both ranked close together in the economic dimension, Will people also expect them to work together on an economically relevant issue? For example, expanding access to low-income housing. We're still exploring these research questions, so please look out for future work from NYU's Diversity and Social Processes Lab on intergroup coalitions and racial stereotyping. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm grateful for my advisor and mentors, Dr. Craig, Michelle, L, Dr. Kraus, our program director, as well as our fellow mentees for their guidance and support throughout the program. Thank you.